So you take this, and you put them in a blender, and... Hello everybody. Today I want to talk about Warhammer Underworlds, Shadespire, and Night Vault. But first I want to talk a little bit about the earlier games that led up to this. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, Games Workshop released a line of smaller scale games set in their Warhammer Fantasy and 40k universes. These games were eventually dubbed their Specialist Games line. Some of them became fairly popular, while others remained very niche. Probably the most popular of all the Specialist games was the game Mordheim. Mordheim took place in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, but instead of the full armies of Warhammer, Mordheim was a game where players took control of much smaller warbands, starting with usually just 5 or 6 models at the beginning of a campaign. This made it a much more affordable game to get into, at least if you had access to the rules. That the models were fully compatible with Warhammer Fantasy and vice versa certainly didn't hurt either. Mordheim got proper updates longer than all the other Specialist games, but eventually it too was discontinued. Because for quite a few years, Games Workshop operated on the somewhat questionable belief that the company should focus only on its 2 largest properties, Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, and that developing anything else would be a waste of time and money. Games Workshop would later reverse this policy, and based on the sales figures turnaround, that was probably the right decision. But the initial spurt of releases of new, smaller games was different than the old Specialist Games line. A lot of these games consisted of models meant to be used in Warhammer 40k, with some relatively inexpensively produced cardboard tokens, game tiles, and slapdash rough around the edges rules for a new game. I played the Lost Patrol with a friend, and it was fun for what it was, but it was very simplistic. And even with the few amount of times we played, we were making house rules before the end to try and balance the game better to make sure both players had an equal chance of winning. It felt almost more like a beta version of the rules than a finished product. The rules for these games were clearly rushed and felt more like an afterthought than the main focus. People didn't mind all that much because most people bought these box sets purely to use the models in 40k. And they offered an alright value for that, at least as far as any brand new Games Workshop product can be an alright value. The actual game rules were more of a fun little bonus, something to play around with for an hour or two, and then set aside, probably never to touch again once you added the models to your army. But people wanted a little something more. They wanted those old Specialist games back, with more depth to their rules. At least they wanted the more popular ones. Mostly they wanted Necromunda and Mordheim. And in August 2017, it looked like that was finally going to happen. Games Workshop released the Necromunda Underhive box set as the beginnings of a reboot of the full Necromunda game. The updates of other gangs have been very slowly coming out, and people were getting excited at the idea of the even more popular Mordheim getting rebooted as well. Then in October 2017, Games Workshop launched Warhammer Underworlds Shadespire. It was obvious right away that this was different than the earlier boxed games GW had sold. Firstly, it was pushed a lot harder as its own brand than those other games. Secondly, this game got a lot of additional warbands added onto it to be playable very quickly. Thirdly, Shadespire got a new addition in the form of Night Vault about a year later. Clearly, this is something GW wants to pursue and has been pretty successful with so far. I recently got a copy of Shadespire with all the additional warbands through some trades and played a few games. I'll be sharing my thoughts on the game based on its own merits as well as comparing it to other Games Workshop games, especially Mordheim, which it's something of a spiritual successor to. But first I want to clarify something. From everything I've heard and read, Shadespire and Night Vault are both the same game. Night Vault has an added magic system and a few other minor rules updates, but other than that, they're both the same and the warbands are both completely compatible with each other. So the game really should be called Warhammer Underworlds to make it clear it's the same game with the same rules system, but most people refer to it as Shadespire or Night Vault due to those being the names the marketing focused on, as well as being larger on the box. Because of this, some people get confused and think Shadespire and Night Vault are different games, but they're not. They're both Warhammer Underworlds. That's what I'm going to refer to it as during this video. Since I don't have any of the Night Vault warbands or rules, I can't really share my thoughts on the magic system, but everything else I say should apply to both sets. Warhammer Underworlds is, like I said earlier, a sort of spiritual successor to Mordheim. It's a skirmish game set in Age of Sigmar like Mordheim was set in Warhammer Fantasy. The game's story revolves around warbands consisting of a handful of individual models searching for magic rocks in a cursed city, just like Mordheim. But the game is very different from Mordheim in many ways too. The RPG elements have been completely removed. In Mordheim, each character in your warband gained experience and could level up stats over time. It was a very campaign-focused game, with characters growing stronger and getting better equipment over multiple games. That's all gone in Warhammer Underworlds, which people who wanted that sort of tabletop squad-based RPG experience will be disappointed by, especially since it's unlikely that Mordheim will get a proper reboot with GW pouring so many resources into Warhammer Underworlds. Instead of experience points that can be spent on increasing stats between games, each fighter can get a preset power boost to their stats once per game when certain conditions are met. The characters have these fighter cards, and when conditions are met, the cards are flipped from the starting stats to the new improved stats. This idea seems really familiar. The conditions that have to be met to flip a card are dependent on the faction you're playing, and could be something like the character getting wounded, or killing an enemy, or getting killed and resurrected if you play undead. The term for a flipped card is inspired. The faction-wide mechanics to flip and inspire your characters are one of the ways each faction plays differently from the others. It seems like flipping your characters for a stat boost would be a big deal, but while it's nice, it honestly isn't nearly as important as other factors in gameplay, particularly your two decks. That's right, I said decks. This is where Warhammer Underworlds is a drastic departure, not just from Mordheim, but pretty much every other Games Workshop miniature game. Not only do you use decks of cards in this game, it's actually a deck building game. Because here's another thing about this game that's very different from Mordheim and even a non-RPG skirmish game like Kill Team. You can't actually pick individual characters for your warband. They're a package deal. The Khorne warband always comes with the same 5 named characters, the Stormcast Eternals with the same 3, and so on. So when it comes to customizing your warband, you have far fewer choices. What you do have a choice about are these decks. Each player has a 12-card objective deck and a 20-card power deck with tons of options of what to put in them. The objective deck is used to get glory tokens. Each card gives certain conditions that award a certain amount of glory tokens when those conditions are met. Whoever has the most glory tokens at the end of the game wins, so the objective deck is absolutely vital if you want to win the game. The power deck has 2 types of cards, ploys and upgrades. Upgrades give a fighter they're played on a permanent boost of some kind, whether it's extra attack dice, defense dice, movement, or whatever, but they have to be paid for with a glory token before they can be played. Glory tokens spent like this still count when determining who wins, but they can only be spent on upgrades once by flipping them over, so the use of upgrades is somewhat restricted. That also sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Ploys don't have this restriction, but only work once before being discarded and are somewhat more situational. I found these power cards to be extremely important to winning the game. The boosts they give make a big difference, usually a lot more so than flipping a fighter card over and it becoming inspired. This is because when a particular fighter card gets flipped and if the stat boost is actually useful at the time is largely dependent on luck, while power cards are much more under the player's control, and so they can usually be used right when they'll make the biggest difference. Aside from where you move your fighters on the board, the cards you put in your deck is the thing you have the most control over and will have the most influence on your games and your chances of winning. Even though they're kept separate, the power deck and the objective deck need to be built to complement each other, and both decks should focus on helping the player do one thing really well. During one game, I tried to build decks that could do a bit of everything, and I got absolutely destroyed. Don't do that. If you want to win glory tokens by claiming objectives tokens on the board, all your cards in both decks should help you do that. If you want to win glory tokens by killing things, which is another route you can go, all your cards should focus on that, and so on. This focus on deck building kind of makes Warhammer Underworlds feel like an unholy cross between a normal Games Workshop skirmish game and Magic the Gathering. How do I feel about that? Well, it has its strengths and weaknesses. On the strengths side, this is probably the most balanced game Games Workshop has ever made. Each warband has preset fighters with preset abilities, and the power and objective decks can't be duplicates with the same type of card. So everyone's spamming the same handful of broken combos, a big problem in competitive play for many editions of Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, is impossible. The FAQs have placed some restrictions on power cards, but they're very minor compared to the restrictions in a game like Magic the Gathering, which makes sense considering Magic the Gathering has a lot more cards added to it by now. All the ambiguity that exists in other Games Workshop tabletop games is also not here, which means far less frustrating arguments, rules lawyering, and ruined friendships. You play on a board where distance is counted in hexes, not inches. There's never any argument about whether you can reach an enemy fighter. Since there's no cover mechanic, just attack and defense dice, that also means no arguing over whether a model's ankle is partially obscured by a tree branch protecting against the missile that's being fired at them. Which is pretty fantastic. Probably my favorite thing about this game over other Games Workshop titles. It feels like Games Workshop was maybe testing the waters a little with those earlier one-shot boxed games they came out with, and figuring out what worked and what didn't to use in this game. The rules definitely feel polished, and it's a good playing experience. On the other hand, Warhammer Underworlds doesn't have most of the interactive story elements of other Games Workshop games. Even in a game without RPG elements like Warhammer 40k, players can build their own armies, pick which troops they want, equip their independent characters however they want, and play specific scenarios like defending a relic or trying to capture communication towers. Because of all these options, players can feel like they're crafting a story when they play, and their victories have consequences for this larger, overarching story. In Warhammer Underworlds, there's not much room left for that. Each warband has a set number of fighters, all of which have names and preset stats. Because your objectives for each game are determined by the objective cards you draw, you're going to be trying to accomplish pretty much the same thing every single game. Most of the imaginative parts for the players have been stripped away to make the game more competitive. Sci-fi and fantasy tabletop battle games have always walked a fine line between being games people play to tell a story and games people play to win. Warhammer Underworlds is pretty far over on the play-to-win side of the scale. There's backstory, but it has about as much connection to your actual games as the backstory of Magic the Gathering. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It all depends on what you want from your tabletop gaming experience. If you're the kind of person who likes to convert up your army and write up a long, detailed backstory, if you're into 40k or Age of Sigmar more for the lore than the actual game, Warhammer Underworlds might not have as much to offer you. On the other hand, if you enjoy the skill and strategy aspect of tabletop gaming, the tension of hoping your dice roll goes well or drawing just the right card, the joy of outwitting your opponent, then this game will probably be great for you. In fact, you'll probably find it a lot less frustrating than the likes of those larger games, because a lot of the annoying mechanics have been removed and replaced with something that works much more smoothly. And if you like a bit of both like me, see if you can either get a copy cheap like I did, or play with a friend after deciding if it's for you. Personally, I found it to be a refreshing change of pace from the normal Games Workshop fare. It's fun. It's fun to play, and the rules actually are easier to get the hang of than I probably made them sound in this video. Of course, the card game Bang is fun to play too and significantly cheaper, but it doesn't give you any cool looking models to paint. So, yeah, that's my broad opinion on Warhammer Underworlds, as well as just giving you a comparison to other games you might have already played. You decide. That's it for this video. The Turnabout Goodbyes video is coming along. We have a new website up, thriftygaming.com, where you can read articles by the Thrifty Gaming crew and buy used models. So check it out if you're interested. I also have an account for the channel on Gab, which is like Twitter, but with less Orwellian censorship and more weirdos as a consequence. And as always, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, as well as commenting if you want to share your thoughts on Warhammer Underworlds. Thanks, and have a great day.